Throughout human history, warfare has produced moments that seem to defy logic, mathematics, and the very nature of human limitation. These are not the grand battles remembered for their strategic brilliance or the deployment of thousands of troops across vast landscapes. These are the intimate, visceral moments where a single soldier stood against impossible odds and refused to fall. What drives a man to fight when every calculation of probability says he should die? What transforms an ordinary soldier into a force of nature that can hold back an entire enemy force? These questions have fascinated military historians for generations, and the answers lie in the extraordinary stories of men who became one-man armies. Let's begin with a cold February day in 1945 near the town of Zwolle in eastern France. The war in Europe was entering its final brutal phase. American forces were pushing into German-held territory, and every yard of ground cost blood. Leading a company of the 3rd Infantry Division was a young officer named Audie Murphy, a baby-faced Texan who stood just 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed barely 140 pounds. He looked more like a high school student than a warrior, but by this point in the war, Murphy had already earned a reputation as one of the most effective combat soldiers in the American Army. What happened on January 26, 1945, would cement his place in military legend forever. Murphy's company had been reduced to just 18 men after weeks of brutal fighting. They were holding a position in frozen woods when German forces launched a massive counterattack. 6 Panzer tanks rolled forward, accompanied by more than 250 infantry soldiers. The American position was hopeless. Murphy ordered his men to fall back to defensive positions in the woods, while he stayed forward to direct artillery fire. He climbed onto a burning M10 tank destroyer that had been hit and was spewing smoke and flames, knowing that the fuel tank could explode at any moment, turning him into a human torch. For the next hour, Murphy used the tank destroyer's .50 caliber machine gun to single-handedly hold off the entire German advance. The details of this action reveal something profound about combat psychology. Murphy was not simply firing blindly into the mass of approaching Germans. He was making calculated decisions with each burst of fire. When the German infantry tried to flank his position, he shifted fire to cut them down. When they attempted to advance directly, he targeted the officers and NCOs first, knowing that leaderless units would falter. The .50 caliber machine gun became an extension of his will, and he fired with such precision that the Germans believed they were facing a much larger force. He was standing on a vehicle that was literally on fire, with ammunition exploding around him, telephone in one hand directing artillery strikes while firing the machine gun with the other. The cold was so intense that the metal of the gun burned his hands, but he never stopped firing. He was wounded in the leg, but ignored it completely. When his ammunition finally ran out, he had killed or wounded more than 50 German soldiers and forced the entire attack to collapse. Only then did he climb down from the burning tank destroyer and lead his men in a counterattack that drove the Germans back. The psychological warfare element of Murphy's stand cannot be overstated. The German commander, seeing his advance stopped by what appeared to be heavy resistance, assumed he was facing a well-fortified position with multiple machine gun nests. The smoke from the burning tank destroyer obscured Murphy's position, making it impossible for the Germans to pinpoint exactly where the fire was coming from. This created a phantom army in the minds of the attacking force. They were being decimated by a ghost. When soldiers cannot identify their enemy's position, fear multiplies. Every burst of fire seems to come from everywhere at once. Murphy understood this instinctively. He varied his rate of fire, sometimes unleashing long bursts to create the impression of multiple guns, other times firing in short, controlled bursts that suggested a well-disciplined defensive line. He was conducting a symphony of destruction, and the Germans danced to his deadly tune. Now shift the timeline back to October 1918, to the Argonne forest in France during the final phase of World War I. The American expeditionary forces were engaged in brutal forest fighting against entrenched German positions. A corporal named Alvin York from the mountains of Tennessee was part of a patrol sent to silence German machine gun nests that were holding up the American advance. York was a reluctant warrior. He had initially filed for conscientious objector status based on his religious beliefs, but had been convinced by his officers that fighting against German aggression was morally justified. He had grown up hunting in the Tennessee mountains, where a single missed shot could mean your family went hungry. This background had turned him into one of the finest marksmen in the American Army, though few people knew it yet. York's patrol ran into disaster almost immediately. They stumbled into a German position and came under withering fire from multiple machine gun nests. The American soldiers were cut down in seconds. 9 were killed, and several others were wounded. York found himself with only 7 men left who were capable of fighting, and they were surrounded by German forces. The logical move would have been to surrender or retreat. York did neither. Instead, he ordered his men to guard the German prisoners they had already captured, and began working his way around the machine gun positions alone. What happened next demonstrates the difference between a soldier and a warrior. York began engaging the German machine gunners using the same techniques he had learned hunting turkeys in the Tennessee hills. In turkey hunting, you cannot alert the flock to your presence. You take out birds one at a time, starting from the back of the group, so the others do not see their companions falling. York applied this exact methodology to the German soldiers. He began picking off the machine gunners one by one, starting with those in the rear positions. Each shot was perfectly placed, dropping a German soldier before he could alert his comrades to York's position. The Germans realized they were under attack, but could not locate where the fire was coming from. York was using the terrain, the trees, and his mountain-bred field craft to remain invisible. The German officer in command of the position, a first lieutenant, realized his men were being systematically eliminated by an unseen shooter. He ordered a squad of 6 soldiers to fix bayonets and charge York's position. This was a critical moment. York had to transition from precision sharpshooting to rapid-fire combat shooting. He dropped his rifle and drew his .45 caliber pistol. As the Germans charged, York shot them down one by one, starting with the last man in the line and working forward, again using his turkey hunting knowledge. By shooting the rear man first, the men in front would not see their comrades falling and would continue to charge, each one running into York's fire in sequence. It was methodical, cold-blooded, and devastatingly effective. All 6 Germans were dead before they reached him. The psychological impact on the remaining German soldiers was catastrophic. They had just watched 6 of their bravest men cut down in seconds by an enemy they still could not see clearly. The machine gun fire that had been so confident minutes before became sporadic and panicked. German soldiers began throwing down their weapons. The German lieutenant, recognizing that continued resistance was futile and would only result in the annihilation of his entire command, surrendered to York. When York marched his prisoners back to American lines, he had captured 132 German soldiers and had killed or wounded more than 25 others. He had done this with less than a full magazine of rifle ammunition and about half a clip from his pistol. His company commander looked at the long column of prisoners and asked York if he had captured the whole German army. York's response was typically modest. He simply said he had been lucky to get them. But luck had nothing to do with it. York had used terrain, tactics, and superior marksmanship to defeat a force that outnumbered him more than 10-1. He had turned the psychological momentum of the battle completely around. The Germans went from being confident defenders to demoralized prisoners in less than an hour because one man refused to accept that the odds made his situation impossible. York had grown up in poverty, hunting to survive, and he brought that survival mentality to the battlefield. When you hunt for food, you do not have the luxury of wasting ammunition or missing shots. Every bullet must count. York applied this discipline to warfare with surgical precision. Move forward to May 2, 1968, and the jungles of Vietnam near Loc Ninh. A Green Beret staff sergeant named Roy Benavidez was at a forward operating base when radio reports came in that a 12-man reconnaissance team had been surrounded by a North Vietnamese army force estimated at over 1,000 soldiers. 3 helicopters had already been shot down trying to extract the team, and it was clear that everyone on the ground was going to die unless someone could get them out. Benavidez was not supposed to be on this mission. He was at the base, recovering from injuries. But when he heard that American soldiers were trapped and dying, he grabbed his medical bag and weapon and jumped onto the next helicopter, heading to the location. As the helicopter approached the landing zone, it came under such intense fire that the pilot said it was impossible to land. Benavidez jumped from the hovering helicopter anyway, falling more than 10 feet to the ground. He immediately began running toward the trapped soldiers, covering about 75 yards of open ground while machine gun fire tore up the earth around him. He was shot in the leg, face, and head before he even reached the team, but he did not stop. When he reached the team's position, he found 4 men dead and the rest wounded and running out of ammunition. The team's sergeant was barely conscious. Benavidez took command of the situation despite his injuries. For the next 6 hours, Benavidez fought with a ferocity that defied human limits. He organized a defensive perimeter, distributed ammunition from dead soldiers to those still fighting, and called in airstrikes so close to his own position that the explosions threw dirt and debris over the defending Americans. He dragged wounded men to a position where helicopters might be able to extract them, all while continuing to fight. He was shot again, this time in the back. Then he was shot in the thigh. A piece of shrapnel tore into his abdomen. He was bayoneted multiple times by North Vietnamese soldiers who got close enough for hand-to-hand combat. His jaw was shattered by a bullet. He killed or wounded dozens of enemy soldiers with rifle fire, grenades, and his bare hands. The most remarkable aspect of Benavidez's actions was his absolute refusal to acknowledge his injuries. Modern combat medicine has shown us that the human body can continue functioning even with catastrophic injuries if the brain refuses to accept defeat. Benavidez had wounds that should have killed him 3 times over, but his mind had entered a state where pain signals were being completely overridden by his determination to save his fellow soldiers. When a helicopter finally managed to land, Benavidez dragged the wounded men to the aircraft one by one. He made multiple trips across ground that was being raked with machine gun fire. He was loading the last wounded soldier onto the helicopter when he was shot in the back again, and a grenade explosion knocked him unconscious. The helicopter crew, seeing him lying motionless covered in blood, assumed he was dead and placed him in a body bag. As the medics were zipping up the body bag, Benavidez managed to spit in the face of the doctor to show he was still alive. That reflex, that tiny act of defiance, saved his life. He had been shot 7 times, had 37 puncture wounds from bayonets and shrapnel, and had lost so much blood that doctors later said he should have been dead long before the helicopter even arrived. But Benavidez survived. He spent a year recovering from his wounds, underwent multiple surgeries, and was told he would never walk again. He proved the doctors wrong on that count too. The actions Benavidez took that day were so extraordinary that when he was first recommended for the Medal of Honor, the army initially rejected it because they thought the account must be exaggerated. It took 13 years, and the testimony of the men he saved before the award was finally approved. Now travel north to the frozen forests of Finland during the winter of 1939 and 1940. The Soviet Union had invaded Finland with overwhelming force, expecting to crush the tiny nation in a matter of weeks. The Soviets brought hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, and the entire weight of one of the world's largest armies. Finland had a small, poorly equipped military and was facing annihilation. But the Finns had something the Soviets did not anticipate. They had soldiers who knew how to fight in the brutal Finnish winter, and they had snipers who turned the frozen forests into killing grounds. The most deadly of these snipers was a farmer named Simo Häyhä. Häyhä was a small, quiet man who had spent his life hunting in the forests around his farm. He was an expert skier and knew the terrain like the back of his hand. When the Soviets invaded, he grabbed his rifle, an old Finnish-made Mosin Nagant M28, and headed to the front lines. What he did over the next 100 days of war has never been equaled by any sniper in history. Häyhä killed over 500 Soviet soldiers and possibly as many as 700, using only iron sights on his rifle. He refused to use a telescopic sight because the glint of the glass could give away his position, and in the extreme cold, the scope could fog up. He relied purely on his natural shooting ability, his knowledge of the forest, and his almost supernatural patience. The tactics Häyhä employed reveal the mindset of a perfect predator. He would arrive at a position hours before dawn, moving through the forest in darkness so silently that even other Finnish soldiers rarely knew he was there. He would prepare his shooting position with meticulous care, packing snow in front of him to prevent the muzzle blast from kicking up snow that would reveal his location. He would place snow in his mouth to prevent his breath from condensing in the cold air and creating a visible cloud. He would lie motionless for hours, waiting for Soviet soldiers to move into his kill zone. When he fired, he would immediately shift position, never firing more than a few shots from the same location. The Soviets were being killed by a ghost. They could not find him, could not pin down his position, could not predict where he would strike next. The Soviet command became obsessed with killing Häyhä. They sent counter-sniper teams specifically to hunt him. They shelled areas where they thought he might be hiding. They even sent in artillery strikes on suspected sniper positions. Nothing worked. Häyhä continued his deadly work day after day, week after week. Soviet soldiers began to call him the White Death, and his reputation spread fear through the Soviet ranks. Some Soviet units refused to advance through certain areas because they knew Häyhä was operating there. A single man with a rifle was affecting the movement of entire Soviet divisions. The psychological warfare aspect of his campaign was as important as the actual kills. Soviet soldiers knew that at any moment, with no warning, a bullet could come out of the white forest and end their lives. They could not see the threat, could not fight back against it, could only wait and hope they were not the next target. On March 6, 1940, Häyhä's incredible run came to an end when he was hit in the face by an explosive bullet fired by a Soviet soldier. Half of his jaw was blown off, and he fell into a coma. The Finnish soldiers who found him thought he was dead, but Häyhä survived, though he was disfigured for life. He woke from his coma on the exact day the Winter War ended. The Soviets had failed to conquer Finland, partly because soldiers like Häyhä had made the cost in blood too high. The Soviets lost hundreds of thousands of men in the war, and the fierce Finnish resistance forced Stalin to accept a negotiated peace rather than complete conquest. One farmer with a rifle had contributed to stopping the Soviet war machine, and his legend has endured as one of the greatest sniper performances in military history. Jump forward to September 2010 and a small outpost in Afghanistan. A British Gurkha soldier named Dipprasad Pun was on sentry duty, alone, when Taliban fighters launched an attack on his position. Intelligence estimates later put the attacking force at somewhere between 30 and 40 Taliban fighters armed with AK-47s, rocket-propelled grenades, and heavy machine guns. Pun was armed with his personal weapon, his kukri knife, and whatever ammunition and grenades he had at his position. The Taliban fighters were certain they could overrun the position and kill the lone sentry before the rest of the base could respond. They were wrong. The attack began with RPG rounds slamming into Pun's Sangha, the fortified guard post he was defending. The explosions should have killed him, but he survived the initial barrage and immediately began returning fire. The Taliban fighters rushed the position, confident that the lone soldier would be dead or too stunned to fight effectively. Instead, they ran into a storm of precisely aimed fire. Pun began working through his arsenal methodically. He fired his rifle in controlled bursts, dropping Taliban fighters as they advanced. When they got closer, he threw grenades, timing each throw perfectly to catch clusters of attackers. He fired his weapon until the barrel was so hot it began to glow. When he ran low on ammunition, he grabbed a machine gun tripod and used it as a club to beat back Taliban fighters who had gotten close enough to the Sangha to try to climb inside. When they kept coming, he drew his kukri knife, the traditional curved blade of the Gurkhas, and prepared for hand-to-hand combat. For 15 minutes, Pun held that position alone against overwhelming odds. He fired more than 400 rounds of ammunition, threw 17 grenades, and detonated a claymore mine at point-blank range when Taliban fighters tried to rush the Sangha entrance. The explosion from the claymore nearly killed him, but it broke the Taliban attack. The surviving fighters fled back into the night, leaving bodies scattered around Pun's position. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found Pun still at his post, still ready to fight, surrounded by evidence of the ferocious battle. He had killed or wounded dozens of Taliban fighters and had prevented them from overrunning the entire outpost. If the Taliban had succeeded in taking Pun's position, they could have attacked the rest of the base from an advantageous position and potentially killed many more British and Afghan soldiers. The Gurkhas have a reputation as some of the fiercest fighters in the world, and Pun's actions that night demonstrated why. The kukri is not just a weapon to a Gurkha soldier, it is a symbol of their warrior culture and their personal honor. The fact that Pun drew his kukri meant he was prepared to die rather than retreat. The Taliban fighters likely did not understand this cultural context, but they learned its significance that night. When a Gurkha draws his blade, he has made a commitment that cannot be broken. Pun was following in a tradition of Gurkha warriors that stretches back centuries, a tradition that values courage, duty, and the willingness to face any odds rather than fail in your mission. His 15-minute stand against 30 or 40 attackers was not just a military victory, it was a cultural statement. It said that some things are worth fighting for even when the fight seems impossible. Now go back to World War II again, this time to the Netherlands in April 1945. A French-Canadian soldier named Leo Major had already earned a reputation as one of the most aggressive and effective scouts in the Canadian Army. He had fought through France after D-Day, had been wounded multiple times, and had lost an eye to a phosphorus grenade explosion but had refused to be sent home. He wore an eye patch and kept fighting. By April 1945, Major's unit was approaching the Dutch city of Zwolle, which was occupied by German forces. The plan was to bombard the city with artillery and then send in troops to clear out the Germans in what would likely be a brutal house-to-house fight. Major had a different idea. He volunteered to scout the city at night with one other soldier to assess the German defenses. When his companion was killed in the initial approach, Major should have returned to Canadian lines and reported that the mission was impossible. Instead, he decided to liberate the entire city by himself. Over the course of one night, Major moved through Zwolle, creating chaos. He would spot a German patrol, ambush them, kill or capture the Germans, then move to another location and do it again. He set buildings on fire to create confusion. He threw grenades into German command posts. He shot German officers. He captured a German staff car and drove it through the streets, firing his weapon at German positions. The Germans had no idea how many Canadian troops were in the city. The attacks seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Major was making so much noise, creating so much destruction, that the German commander believed he was facing a major assault by a large Canadian force. As the night went on, Major's one-man campaign intensified. He found the local resistance members and convinced them to start making noise, banging pots and pans, setting off firecrackers, anything to add to the confusion. The Germans were in a panic. Their communications were disrupted, their officers were dead or missing, and they had no clear picture of what they were facing. By dawn, the German commander made the decision to withdraw his forces from the city rather than face what he believed was a major Canadian assault. Major had convinced an entire German garrison to abandon a strategically important city without any support, without any backup, armed with only his personal weapons and an absolutely insane amount of courage and tactical creativity. When Canadian forces entered Zwolle the next morning, they found the city largely intact and the German forces gone. Major had prevented the artillery bombardment that would have destroyed much of the city and killed many Dutch civilians. The people of Zwolle credit him with saving their city, and to this day, there are memorials to Leo Major in the Netherlands. The psychological elements of Major's operation are fascinating to analyze. He understood that in warfare, perception often matters more than reality. By creating the impression of a large-scale attack, he triggered the German commander's natural tendency to overestimate the threat. Humans are wired to assume the worst in ambiguous situations, especially in combat. When you cannot clearly see your enemy, when attacks are coming from multiple directions, when your command structure is disrupted, the mind fills in the gaps with fear. Major weaponized this psychological vulnerability. He turned one man with a rifle into what appeared to be a company-sized assault force. This was not just bravery, it was tactical genius combined with an understanding of human psychology under stress. Return to the Pacific theater of World War II, to Guadalcanal in October 1942. The battle for Guadalcanal was one of the most brutal campaigns of the Pacific War, with American and Japanese forces locked in desperate combat for control of the island. A Marine named John Basilone was manning a machine gun position with his unit when Japanese forces launched a massive night attack against the American lines. The Japanese came in waves, hundreds of soldiers screaming and charging through the jungle darkness. Basilone's machine gun position was critical to holding the American line. If it fell, the Japanese could break through and potentially overrun the entire American position. For the next 2 days and nights, Basilone fought almost continuously. His machine guns ran so hot from constant firing that the barrels began to glow red in the darkness. When his ammunition ran out, he fought through enemy fire to get more, carrying belts of ammunition weighing nearly 100 pounds across ground that was being swept with machine gun fire and mortar explosions. When one of his machine guns was destroyed, he repaired it under fire. When another gun crew was killed, he took over their position. He moved from gun to gun, keeping up a constant rate of fire that cut down wave after wave of Japanese soldiers. His hands were burned raw from handling the superheated metal of the machine gun barrels, but he never stopped fighting. Japanese soldiers got close enough to throw grenades into his position, and Basilone threw them back. Some accounts say he killed over 30 Japanese soldiers with his pistol and a machete when they overran his position in hand-to-hand combat. By the time the battle ended, Japanese bodies were piled in front of Basilone's position. He had held his section of the line through sheer determination and an almost superhuman endurance. Other Marines said later that Basilone did the work of an entire platoon that night. His actions prevented a Japanese breakthrough that could have led to the defeat of American forces on Guadalcanal. The strategic importance of his stand cannot be overstated. Guadalcanal was the first major offensive victory for American forces in the Pacific, and it marked the turning point where American forces went from defensive operations to offensive campaigns that would eventually lead to the defeat of Japan. If the Japanese had broken through Basilone's position, the entire campaign could have ended very differently. Basilone became one of the most famous Marines in American history, was sent home to sell war bonds, and could have sat out the rest of the war as a hero. But he requested to return to combat, saying he belonged with his men. He was killed in February 1945 during the invasion of Iwo Jima while leading an assault against Japanese positions. His death was a tremendous loss, but his legacy as one of the most effective machine gunners in military history was secure. He had shown that one soldier with the right weapons and the determination to use them could hold back an entire army. Now travel back to May 1945 in Burma, where British and Commonwealth forces were fighting to push Japanese troops out of Southeast Asia. A Gurkha rifleman named Lachhiman Gurung was part of a forward position when Japanese forces launched a night attack. The Japanese threw grenades into the Gurkha positions, trying to soften up the defenders before a ground assault. Gurung began catching the grenades and throwing them back at the Japanese, a suicidally dangerous task that required perfect timing and nerves of steel. He successfully threw back 2 grenades. The third grenade exploded in his hand, blowing off his fingers, shattering his right arm, and severely wounding his face and body. He should have been incapacitated, but Gurung was not done fighting. Despite his catastrophic injuries, despite being able to use only his left hand, despite the pain that must have been overwhelming, Gurung propped his rifle against his shattered right arm and began firing at the attacking Japanese soldiers with his left hand. For the next 4 hours, he held his position alone. His fellow soldiers had been forced to fall back, and Gurung was the only thing standing between the Japanese and a breakthrough of the British lines. He fired his rifle with his left hand, reloaded it with one hand by bracing the weapon against his body, and continued to fight. Japanese soldiers charged his position repeatedly, and each time Gurung cut them down with precisely aimed fire. He was fighting in darkness, badly wounded, using only one hand, and he never faltered. When dawn finally came and reinforcements arrived, they found Gurung still at his post, surrounded by the bodies of 31 Japanese soldiers that he had killed. He had fired every round of ammunition available to him and would have continued fighting with his kukri knife if the Japanese had kept attacking. His wounds were so severe that he was partially blinded and permanently disabled, but he had held his position and prevented a Japanese breakthrough. The determination Gurung showed that night goes beyond normal concepts of courage. He had entered a mental state where his physical condition was irrelevant, where pain was just background noise, where the only thing that mattered was the mission. This is the state that separates ordinary soldiers from warriors who become legends. Move forward to July 1999 and the Kargil War between India and Pakistan in the Himalayan mountains. An Indian army soldier named Yogendra Singh Yadav was part of a platoon assigned to capture a strategic peak called Tiger Hill that had been occupied by Pakistani forces. The peak was nearly vertical, covered in ice and snow, and the Pakistani soldiers held fortified positions at the top with machine guns and artillery support. The Indian assault force had to climb the mountain under fire, which is about as close to a suicide mission as warfare gets. The first 3 men in the assault were killed almost immediately. Yadav was 4th in line, and he kept climbing. He was hit by 3 bullets as he climbed, 1 in his shoulder, 1 in his arm, and 1 in his leg, but he continued to ascend the mountain. When he reached a Pakistani machine gun bunker, he was hit by grenade shrapnel and fell backward down the cliff. He should have died from the fall, but he managed to grab onto rocks and stop his descent. Then, despite his wounds, despite having just fallen down a mountain, he climbed back up. He reached the Pakistani bunker again, and this time, he killed 4 Pakistani soldiers in hand-to-hand combat, clearing the bunker and allowing the rest of his platoon to advance. He was 19 years old at the time. Yadav's wounds were so severe that when he was evacuated, the Indian Army initially reported him as killed in action. He had been shot multiple times, hit with grenade fragments, and had fallen down a mountain, but he survived. He spent months recovering from his injuries and eventually returned to active duty. His actions on Tiger Hill were critical to the Indian Army's success in capturing the peak, which was one of the turning points of the Kargil War. The fact that a teenager, barely out of training, could display this level of courage and determination speaks to something fundamental about the human capacity for heroism under the right circumstances. Yadav did not think about the impossibility of his situation. He simply kept moving forward, kept fighting, kept refusing to accept defeat. Finally, consider the extraordinary career of Adrian Carton de Wiart, a British Army officer whose life reads like something from an adventure novel. De Wiart fought in 4 wars over nearly 5 decades, from the Boer War to World War II, and was wounded so many times that he became a legend for his apparent indestructibility. He was shot in the face, head, stomach, ankle, leg, hip, and ear. He survived 2 plane crashes. He tunneled out of a prisoner of war camp when he was 64 years old. He lost his left eye in the Battle of Somaliland and lost his left hand in the Battle of the Somme, but he continued to fight. When doctors refused to amputate his fingers after a wound, he reportedly chewed them off himself because they were interfering with his ability to fight. De Wiart's approach to warfare was simple. He led from the front, exposed himself to enemy fire constantly, and seemed to believe that he was personally immune to death. His men followed him because he never asked them to do anything he would not do himself, and because his fearlessness under fire was contagious. In World War I, he was recommended for the Victoria Cross for leading an attack on enemy trenches where he captured German positions despite being wounded multiple times. In World War II, he was sent to command British forces in Norway, where he led defensive operations against the German invasion. When the Germans captured him, he spent 2 years trying to escape from prisoner of war camps before finally succeeding by digging a tunnel. He was 64 years old and had 1 hand and 1 eye, but he still managed to escape. After the war, de Wiart wrote a memoir where he famously stated, "Frankly, I had enjoyed the war." This statement shocked many people, but it revealed something important about de Wiart's psychology. He was not a bloodthirsty maniac. He was a man who had found his purpose in life in combat, who believed deeply in duty and honor, and who saw warfare as the ultimate test of these values. He was wounded 11 times, mentioned in dispatches 8 times, and was awarded numerous medals for valor. He lived to be 83 years old, dying peacefully in his sleep, which seemed almost unfair given how many times bullets, bombs, and shrapnel had tried to kill him. These 10 stories represent something fundamental about human nature and the extremes of what people can accomplish when pushed to the absolute limit. Each of these men faced situations where surrender or retreat would have been completely rational, where the odds were so stacked against them that fighting seemed pointless, where death was not just likely but seemed inevitable. Yet each of them chose to fight. They did not do this because they were superhuman. They were ordinary men who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and made the decision that their lives mattered less than their duty, their comrades, or their mission. Military historians have spent decades studying what creates these moments of extreme heroism. Is it training? Certainly, training plays a role. Every one of these men had been taught to fight, had drilled countless times on weapons handling and tactics, and that training became instinct when their conscious minds were overwhelmed by the chaos of combat. But training alone does not explain what happened. Plenty of well-trained soldiers surrender when faced with overwhelming odds. The difference lies somewhere in the intersection of personality, circumstance, and a kind of mental state that most people never experience. Combat psychologists have identified a phenomenon they call flow state or the warrior's trance, where soldiers in extreme combat situations report a sense of time slowing down, an absence of fear, and a hyper-focus on the immediate tactical situation. Pain signals are suppressed. Fatigue disappears. The soldier becomes pure function, a fighting machine operating at maximum efficiency. This state is not something that can be taught or reliably induced. It emerges spontaneously in some people under extreme stress. Every one of the men in these stories showed evidence of entering this state. Audie Murphy standing on a burning tank for an hour, Benavidez fighting for 6 hours with catastrophic wounds, Lachhiman Gurung firing his rifle with one hand for 4 hours. These are not normal human behaviors. These are examples of the mind overriding the body's natural limits and survival instincts. There is also a cultural component that cannot be ignored. Many of these men came from military traditions that emphasized honor, duty, and the willingness to die rather than fail. The Gurkhas have a centuries-old warrior culture. Audie Murphy grew up in Depression-era Texas, where self-reliance and toughness were survival necessities. Alvin York came from the mountains of Tennessee, where independence and self-sufficiency were core values. These cultural backgrounds created a framework where personal sacrifice for a larger cause was not just acceptable, but expected. When these men faced their moments of crisis, they had mental models to fall back on, examples from their cultures and their own lives that said standing and fighting was the right choice even when it seemed suicidal. The tactical elements in these stories also reveal patterns. Almost every one of these men used terrain and positioning to their advantage. Simo Häyhä knew every tree and hill in the Finnish forests. Leo Major used the buildings and streets of Zwolle to create confusion. Audie Murphy used the smoke from the burning tank destroyer to obscure his position. They understood instinctively that modern weapons could make one man as deadly as many if he used them correctly. A machine gun in the hands of John Basilone became a force multiplier that could stop hundreds of advancing troops. A rifle in the hands of Alvin York became a precision instrument that could take down enemy after enemy with perfect accuracy. These men were not just brave, they were tactically brilliant, making split-second decisions that professional military officers might struggle with given hours of planning time. The psychological impact these individuals had on their enemies is worth examining in detail. When soldiers realize they are facing an opponent who will not quit, who cannot be intimidated, who keeps fighting no matter how many times you hit him, it creates a unique form of terror. The normal rules of combat no longer apply. You cannot break his will. You cannot make him run. The only way to stop him is to kill him, and even that might not work immediately. This realization is devastating to morale. The Soviet soldiers facing Simo Häyhä knew that any moment could be their last, and they had no way to prevent it. The Germans attacking Audie Murphy's position kept advancing into a storm of fire that never slacked, never paused, never gave them any opening to exploit. The Japanese soldiers charging John Basilone's machine guns must have felt like they were attacking a fortress wall, their comrades falling in heaps, while the guns just kept firing. These one-man army moments also had strategic effects that went far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Audie Murphy's stand allowed his company to regroup and launch a counterattack that drove back a major German offensive. Alvin York's capture of 132 German soldiers opened up a critical section of the Argonne forest for the American advance. Benavidez's actions saved the lives of men who had critical intelligence about enemy positions. Simo Häyhä contributed to the Finnish defense that forced the Soviet Union to accept a negotiated peace. Each of these individual actions rippled outward, affecting the larger strategic picture in ways that could not have been predicted. There is something almost mythological about these stories, and that creates both opportunities and dangers for how we understand them. The opportunity is that these stories can inspire people to understand their own potential for courage and determination. The danger is that they can be romanticized in ways that obscure the reality of combat. War is not glorious. It is terrifying, brutal, and traumatic. The men in these stories did not fight because they enjoyed killing or because they were seeking glory. They fought because circumstances left them no choice, because their brothers in arms needed them, because their sense of duty overrode their survival instinct. Many of them were haunted by their experiences afterward. Audie Murphy suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder for the rest of his life. Roy Benavidez spent years recovering from his physical wounds and likely carried psychological wounds that never fully healed. What these stories ultimately teach us is not that war creates heroes, but that ordinary people contain depths of courage and capability that only emerge under the most extreme circumstances. These men were not born warriors. They were farmers, factory workers, mountain boys, soldiers who did their jobs day after day until one day the job required something extraordinary and they rose to meet it. They remind us that human beings are capable of both terrible violence and incredible selflessness, often simultaneously. They fought with savage effectiveness to kill their enemies, but they fought to save their friends and complete their missions, not for hatred or bloodlust. The weapons and tactics have changed since many of these events occurred. Modern warfare looks very different from the muddy trenches of World War I or even the jungles of Vietnam, but the fundamental human elements remain the same. Soldiers still face impossible odds. They still have to make split-second decisions with life-or-death consequences. They still experience fear, exhaustion, and pain. And occasionally, very rarely, a soldier still finds themselves in a situation where they must stand alone against overwhelming force, and somehow, impossibly, they prevail. These moments continue to happen in modern conflicts, in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the deserts of Iraq, in operations that may remain classified for decades. The warriors change, but the warrior spirit remains constant across time and cultures. Understanding these stories requires us to hold multiple truths simultaneously. We must acknowledge the courage and skill of these individuals without glorifying the violence they were forced to commit. We must recognize their achievements without pretending that war is anything other than a horrific human tragedy. We must honor their service while working to create a world where such sacrifices are not necessary. These men became legends not because they sought fame, but because when the moment demanded everything they had, they gave it. That is the essence of heroism, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it, not superhuman strength, but ordinary humans pushing past every limit to do what must be done. The detailed examination of these 10 moments reveals patterns in how individuals can, under the right circumstances with the right combination of training, determination, and tactical awareness, achieve things that seem to defy the basic mathematics of warfare. A single well-trained, determined soldier with effective weapons and good tactical positioning can inflict casualties and disrupt enemy operations far beyond what their numbers would suggest. This is not magic or superhuman ability. It is the result of training combining with determination and circumstance to create moments of extreme effectiveness. But it also requires a willingness to accept enormous personal risk, to continue fighting when wounded, to ignore the body's signals to stop and rest and survive. These stories endure because they speak to something deep in human nature, the desire to believe that individual courage and determination matter, that one person can make a difference even in the face of overwhelming opposition. In an age where warfare increasingly involves drones, precision missiles, and technology that puts vast distances between soldiers and their targets, these stories of close-range, personal combat feel almost anachronistic. But they remain relevant because they remind us that at the core of warfare, regardless of technology, are human beings making human decisions under inhuman pressure. The technology changes, but the human element remains constant. As long as wars are fought, there will be moments where a soldier stands alone against impossible odds and must decide whether to run or fight. These 10 stories show us what happens when someone chooses to fight and refuses to stop until the fight is won or they are dead. That is the legacy of the one-man army, not invincibility but absolute commitment, not fearlessness but courage that transcends fear, not superhuman ability but human will pushed to its absolute limit and beyond.